Rajput. Rajput is a large multi-component cluster of castes, kin bodies, and local groups, sharing social status and ideology of genealogical descent originating from the Indian subcontinent. The term Rajput covers various patrilineal clans historically associated with warriorhood. Several clans claim Rajput status, although not all claims are universally accepted. According to modern scholars, almost all Rajputs clans originated from peasant or pastoral communities. The term Rajput acquired its present meaning only in the 16th century, although it is also anachronistically used to describe the earlier lineages that emerged in northern India from the 6th century onwards. In the 11th century, the term Rajaputra appeared as a non-hereditary designation for royal officials. Gradually, the Rajputs emerged as a social class comprising people from a variety of ethnic and geographical backgrounds. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the membership of this class became largely hereditary, although new claims to Rajput status continued to be made in the later centuries. Several Rajput-ruled kingdoms played a significant role in many regions of central and northern India until the 20th century. The Rajput population and the former Rajput states are found in northern, western, central and eastern India as well as southern and eastern Pakistan. These areas include Rajasthan, Haryana, Gujarat, Eastern Punjab, Western Punjab, Uttar Pradesh, Himachal Pradesh, Jammu, Uttarakhand, Madhya Pradesh and Sindh. History. The origin of the Rajputs has been a much debated topic among historians. Modern historians agree that Rajputs consisted of mixing of various different social groups including Shudras and tribals. British colonial-era writers characterized them as descendants of the foreign invaders such as the Scythians or the Huns, and believed that the Agnicula myth was invented to conceal their foreign origin. According to this theory, the Rajputs originated when these invaders were assimilated into the Kshatriya category during the 6th or 7th century, following the collapse of the Gupta Empire. While many of these colonial writers propagated this foreign origin theory in order to legitimize the colonial rule, the theory was also supported by some Indian scholars, such as D.R. Bhandarkar. Historian C.V. Vaidya believed the Rajputs to be descendants of the ancient Vedic Aryan Kshatriyas. A third group of historians, which includes Jayanarayan Asopa, theorized that the Rajputs were Brahmins who became rulers. However, recent research suggests that the Rajputs came from a variety of ethnic and geographical backgrounds as well as from various Varnas including Shudras. Nearly all Rajputs clans originated from peasant or pastoral communities. Modern historical research suggests that the Rajput community has originated from existing communities such as Bhils, Mars, Meenas, Gujars, Jats, Raikas as opposed to the colonial ethnographic accounts where these communities claimed a Rajput origin. The root word Rajaputra, literally, son of a king, first appears as a designation for royal officials in the 11th century Sanskrit inscriptions. According to some scholars, it was reserved for the immediate relatives of a king. Others believe that it was used by a larger group of high-ranking men. The derivative word Rajput meant horse soldier, trooper, headman of a village, or subordinate chief, before the 15th century. Individuals with whom the word Rajput was associated before the 15th century were considered Varna Samkara, mixed caste origin, and inferior to Kshatriya. Over time, the term Rajput came to denote a hereditary political status, which was not necessarily very high. The term could denote a wide range of rank holders, from an actual son of a king to the lowest ranked landholder. According to scholars, in medieval times, the political units of India were probably ruled most often by men of very low birth, and this may be equally applicable for many clans of Rajputs in northern India. Bertenstein explains that this process of allowing rulers, frequently of low social origin, clean rank via social mobility in the Hindu Varna system serves as one of the explanations of the longevity of the unique Indian civilization. Gradually, the term Rajput came to denote a social class, which was formed when the various tribal and nomadic groups became landed aristocrats, and transformed into the ruling class. These groups assumed the title, Rajput, as part of their claim to higher social positions and ranks. The early medieval literature suggests that this newly formed Rajput class comprised people from multiple castes. Thus, the Rajput identity is not the result of a shared ancestry. Rather, it emerged when different social groups of medieval India sought to legitimize their newly acquired political power, whereby claiming Kshatriya status. These groups started identifying as Rajput at different times, in different ways. Thus, modern scholars summarize that Rajputs were a group of open status, since the 8th century, mostly illiterate warriors who claimed to be reincarnates of ancient Indian Kshatriyas, a claim that had no historical basis. Moreover, this unfounded Kshatriya status claim showed a sharp contrast to the classical Varna of Kshatriyas as depicted in Hindu literature, in which Kshatriyas are depicted as an educated and urbanite clan. Historian Thomas R. Metcalf mentions the opinion of Indian scholar K. M. Panika, who also considers the famous Rajput dynasties of medieval India to have come from non-Kshatriya castes. During the era of the Mughal Empire, hypergamous marriage, with the combination of service in the state army, was another way a tribal family could convert to Rajput. This process required a change in tradition, dressing, ending window remarriage, etc. Such marriage of a tribal family with an acknowledged but possibly poor Rajput family would ultimately enable the non-Rajput family to become Rajput. This marriage pattern also supports the fact that Rajput was an open caste category, available to those who served the Mughals. Rajput formation continued in the colonial era. Even in the 19th century, anyone from The, village landlord, to The, newly wealthy lower caste Shudra, could employ Brahmins to retrospectively fabricate a genealogy, and within a couple of generations they would gain acceptance as Hindu Rajputs. This process would get mirrored by communities in North India. This process of origin of the Rajput community resulted in hypergamy as well as female infanticide that was common in Hindu Rajput clans. Scholars refer to this as Rajputization, which, like Sanskritization, was a mode for upward mobility. But it differed from Sanskritization in other attributes like the method of worship, lifestyle, diet, social interaction, rules for women and marriage, etc. German historian Hermann Kulke has coined the term, secondary Rajputization, for describing the process of members of a tribe trying to re-associate themselves with the former chief of their tribe who had already transformed himself into a Rajput via Rajputization and thus become Rajputs themselves. Scholarly opinions differ on when the term Rajput acquired hereditary connotations and came to denote a clan-based community. Historian Brajadulal Chattopadhyay, based on his analysis of inscriptions primarily from Rajasthan, believed that by the 12th century, the term Rajaputra was associated with fortified settlements, kin-based landholding, and other features that later became indicative of the Rajput status. According to Chattopadhyay, the title acquired an element of heredity from c. 1300. A later study by of 11th-14th century inscriptions from western and central India, by Michael B. Bednar, concludes that the designations such as Rajaputra, Thakura, and Rota were not necessarily hereditary. During this period, sociologists like Sarah Faris and Reinhard Bendix state that the original Kshatriyas in the northwest who existed until Mauryan times in tiny kingdoms were an extremely cultured, educated and intellectual group who were a threat to the intellectual monopoly of the Brahmins. According to Max Weber, ancient texts show they were not subordinate to the Brahmins in religious matters. These Kshatriyas were later undermined not only by the Brahmin priests of the time but were replaced by the emerging community of Rajputs, who were illiterate mercenaries who worked for kings. Unlike the Kshatriyas, the Rajputs were generally illiterate, hence their rise did not present a threat to intellectual monopoly of the Brahmins, and the Rajputs accepted the superiority of the educated Brahmin community. Rajputs were involved in nomadic pastoralism, animal husbandry and cattle trade until much later than popularly believed. The 17th century chronicles of Manhattan Nansini i.e. Manhattan Nansi Ri Khyat and Marwar Ra Paraganan Ri Vigid discuss disputes between Rajputs pertaining to cattle raids. In addition, folk deities of the Rajputs Babuji, Malinath, Goaji and Ramdeo were considered protectors of cattle herding communities. They also imply struggle among Rajputs for domination over cattle and pasturelands. The emergence of Rajput community was the result of a gradual change from mobile pastoral and tribal groups into landed sedentary ones. This necessitated control over mobile resources for agrarian expansion, which in turn necessitated kinship structures, martial and marital alliances. During its formative stages, the Rajput class was quite assimilative and absorbed people from a wide range of lineages. However, by the late 16th century, it had become genealogically rigid, based on the ideas of blood purity. The membership of the Rajput class was now largely inherited rather than acquired through military achievements. A major factor behind this development was the consolidation of the Mughal Empire, whose rulers had great interest in genealogy. As the various Rajput chiefs became Mughal feudatories, they no longer engaged in major conflicts with each other. This decreased the possibility of achieving prestige through military action, and made hereditary prestige more important. The word Rajput thus acquired its present-day meaning in the 16th century. During 16th and 17th centuries, the Rajput rulers and their bards Charans sought to legitimize the Rajput sociopolitical status on the basis of descent and kinship. They fabricated genealogies linking the Rajput families to the ancient dynasties, and associated them with myths of origins that established their Kshatriya status. This led to the emergence of what Indologist Dirk Kulf calls the Rajput Great Tradition, which accepted only hereditary claims to a Rajput identity, and fostered a notion of eliteness and exclusivity. The legendary epic poem Prithviraj Raso, which depicts warriors from several different Rajput clans as associates of Prithviraj Chauhan, fostered a sense of unity among these clans. The text thus contributed to the consolidation of the Rajput identity by offering these clans a shared history. Despite these developments, migrant soldiers made new claims to the Rajput status until as late as the 19th century. In the 19th century, the colonial administrators of India reimagined the Rajputs as similar to the Anglo-Saxon knights. They compiled the Rajput genealogies in the process of settling land disputes, surveying castes and tribes, and writing history. These genealogies became the basis of distinguishing between the genuine and the spurious Rajput clans. Scholars also give recent examples of successful assimilations into the Rajput communities by communities not associated with warriorhood even as late as the early 20th century. William Rowe discusses an example of a Shudra caste, the Nonias caste of salt makers from Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. A large section of this caste that had become Chauhan Rajputs over 3 generations in the British Raj era. The more wealthy or advanced Nonias started by forming the Sri Rajput Pacharni Sabha, Rajput Advancement Society, in 1898 and emulating the Rajput lifestyle. They also started wearing of sacred thread. Rowe states that at a historic meeting of the caste in 1936, every child in this Nonia section knew about their Rajput heritage. Similarly, Donald Atwood and Baviskar give an example of a caste of shepherds who were formerly Shudras successfully changed their status to Rajput in the Raj era and started wearing the sacred thread. They are now known as Sagar Rajputs. The scholars consider this example as a case among thousands. Researchers give examples of the Rajputs of both divisions of present-day Uttarakhand, Garhwal and Kumaon and show how they were formerly Shudra or ritually low but had successfully assimilated into Rajput community at different times. These Rajputs of Kumaon had successfully attained Rajput identity during the reign of Chand Rajas, which ended in 1790. Similarly, these Rajputs of Garhwal were shown by Gerald Berriman to have a ritually low status until as late as the 20th century. The Rajput kingdoms were disparate, loyalty to a clan was more important than allegiance to the wider Rajput social grouping, meaning that one clan would fight another. This and the internecine jostling for position that took place when a clan leader, Raja, died meant that Rajput politics were fluid and prevented the formation of a coherent Rajput empire. The first major Rajput kingdom was the Sisodia-ruled kingdom of Mewar. However, the term Rajput has also been used as an anachronistic designation for leading martial lineages of 11th and 12th centuries that confronted the Ghaznavid and Ghur invaders such as the Pratiharas, the Chahmanas of Shakambhari, Nadol and Jalor, the Tomaris, the Chulukyas, the Paramaras, the Gahadivalas, and the Chandelas. Although the Rajput identity did not exist at this time, these lineages were classified as aristocratic Rajput clans in the later time. In the 15th century, the Muslim sultans of Malwa and Gujarat put a joint effort to overcome the Mewar ruler Rana Kumbha, but both the sultans were defeated. Subsequently, in 1518 the Rajput Mewar kingdom under Rana Sanga achieved a major victory over Sultan Ibrahim Lodhi of Delhi Sultanate and aft. Erwad's Rana's influence extended up to the striking distance of Pili Akhar in Agra. Accordingly, Rana Sanga came to be the most distinguished indigenous contender for supremacy but was defeated by the Mughal invader Babur at Battle of Khanwa in 1527. Legendary accounts state that from 1200 CE, many Rajput groups moved eastwards towards the eastern Gangatic plains forming their own chieftaincies. These minor Rajput kingdoms were dotted all over the Gangatic plains in modern-day Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. During this process, petty clashes occurred with the local population and in some cases, alliances were formed. Among these Rajput chieftaincies were the Bhojpur Zamindars and the taluks of Awadh. The immigration of Rajput clan chiefs into these parts of the Gangatic plains also contributed the agri-cultural appropriation of previously forested areas, especially in South Bihar. Some have linked this eastwards expansion with the onset of Ghurid invasion in the west. From as early as the 16th century, Purbiya Rajput soldiers from the eastern regions of Bihar and Awadh were recruited as mercenaries for Rajputs in the west, particularly in the Malwa region. After the mid-16th century, many Rajput rulers formed close relationships with the Mughal emperors and served them in different capacities. It was due to the support of the Rajputs that Akbar was able to lay the foundations of the Mughal Empire in India. Some Rajput nobles gave away their daughters in marriage to Mughal emperors and princes for political motives. For example, Akbar accomplished 40 marriages for himself, his sons and grandsons, out of which 17 were Rajput Mughal alliances. Akbar's successors as Mughal emperors, his son Jahangir and grandson Shah Jahan had Rajput mothers. The ruling Sisodia Rajput family of Mewar made it a point of honor not to engage in matrimonial relationships with Mughals and thus claimed to stand apart from those Rajput clans who did so. Once Mewar had submitted, an alliance of Rajputs reached a measure of stability. Matrimonial between leading Rajput states and Mughals became rare. Akbar's intimate involvement with the Rajputs had begun when he returned from a pilgrimage to the Chishti Sufi Sheikh at Sikri, west of Agra, in 1561. Many Rajput princesses were married to Akbar, but still Rajput princes were allowed to maintain their religion. Akbar's diplomatic policy regarding the Rajputs was later damaged by the intolerant rules introduced by his great-grandson Aurangzeb. A prominent example of these rules included the re-imposition of jizya, which had been abolished by Akbar. However, despite imposition of jizya, Aurangzeb's army had a high proportion of Rajput officers in the upper ranks of the imperial army, and they were all exempted from paying jizya. The Rajputs then revolted against the Mughal Empire. Aurangzeb's conflicts with the Rajputs, which commenced in the early 1680, henceforth became a contributing factor towards the downfall of the Mughal Empire. In the 18th century, the Rajputs came under influence of the Maratha Empire. By the late 18th century, the Rajput rulers began negotiations with the East India Company, and by 1818 all the Rajput states had formed an alliance with the company. The medieval bardic chronicles Kavya and Masnavi glorified the Rajput past, presenting warriorhood and honor as Rajput ideals. This later became the basis of the British reconstruction of the Rajput history and the nationalist interpretations of Rajput struggles with the Muslim invaders. James Todd, a British colonial official, was impressed by the military qualities of the Rajputs but is today considered to have been unusually enamored of them. Although the group venerate him to this day, he is viewed by many historians since the late 19th century as being a not particularly reliable commentator. Jason Freitag, his only significant biographer, has said that Todd is manifestly biased. The Rajput practices of female infanticide and sati widow immolation were other matters of concern to the British. It was believed that the Rajputs were the primary adherents to these practices, which the British Raj considered savage and which provided the initial impetus for British ethnographic studies of the subcontinent that eventually manifested itself as a much wider exercise in social engineering. On India's independence in 1947, the princely states, including those of the Rajput, were given three options: join either India or Pakistan, or remain independent. Rajput rulers of the 22 princely states of Rajputana acceded to newly independent India, amalgamated into the new state of Rajasthan in 1949-1950. Initially, the Maharajas were granted funding from the Privy Purse in exchange for their acquiescence, but a series of land reforms over the following decades weakened their power, and their Privy Purse was cut off during Indira Gandhi's administration under the 1971 Constitution 26th Amendment Act. The estates, treasures, and practices of the old Rajput rulers now form a key part of Rajasthan's tourist trade and cultural memory. In 1951, the Rajput Rana dynasty of Nepal came to an end, having been the power behind the throne of the Shah dynasty figureheads since 1846. The Rajput Dogra dynasty of Kashmir and Jammu also came to an end in 1947, though title was retained until monarchy was abolished in 1971 by the 26th Amendment to the Constitution of India. There have been several cases of sati burning a widow alive in India from 1943 to 1987. According to an Indian scholar, there are 28 cases since 1947. Although the widows were from several different communities, Rajput widows accounted for 19 cases. The most famous of these cases is of a Rajput woman named Roop Kamwar. 40,000 Rajputs gathered on the street of Jaipur in October 1987 for supporting her sati. A pamphlet circulated on that day attacked independent and westernized women who opposed a woman's duty of worshipping her husband as demons, treated by the practice of sati. This incident again affirmed the low status of women in the Rajput community, and the leaders of this pro-sati movement gained in political terms. The Rajputs, in states such as Madhya Pradesh, are today considered to be a forward caste in India's system of positive Discrimination. This means that they have no access to reservations here. But they are classified as another backward class by the National Commission for Backward Classes in the state of Karnataka. However, some Rajputs, as with other agricultural castes, demand reservations in government jobs. The term Rajput denotes a cluster of castes, clans, and lineages. It is a vaguely defined term, and there is no universal consensus on which clans make up the Rajput community. In medieval Rajasthan, the historical Rajputana, and its neighboring areas, the word Rajput came to be restricted to certain specific clans, based on patrilineal descent and intermarriages. On the other hand, the Rajput communities living in the region to the east of Rajasthan had a fluid and inclusive nature. The Rajputs of Rajasthan eventually refused to acknowledge the Rajput identity claimed by their eastern counterparts, such as the Bindelas. The Rajputs claim to be Kshatriyas or descendants of Kshatriyas, but their actual status varies greatly, ranging from princely lineages to common cultivators. There are several major subdivisions of Rajputs, known as Vansh or Vamsha, the step below the superdivision Jati. These Vansh delineate claimed descent from various sources, and the Rajput are generally considered to be divided into three primary Vansh. Suryavanshi denotes descent from the solar deity Surya, Chandravanshi, Somavanshi, from the lunar deity Chandra, and Agnivanshi from the fire deity Agni. The Agnivanshi clans include Parmar, Chalukya, Solanki, Parihar, and Chauhan. Lesser noted Vansh include Udayvanshi, Rajvanshi, and Rishavanshi. The histories of the various Vanshas were later recorded in documents known as Vamshavalis. Andre Wink counts these among the status legitimizing texts. Beneath the Vansh division are smaller and smaller subdivisions: Kul, Shak, Branch, Khump or Khump twig, and Nak twig tip. Marriages within a Kul are generally disallowed, with some flexibility for Kul mates of different Gotra lineages. The Kul serves as the primary identity for many of the Rajput clans, and each Kul is protected by a family goddess, the Kul Devi. Lindsay Harlan notes that in some cases, Shaks have become powerful enough to be functionally Kuls in their own right. Culture and ethos. The Rajputs were designated as a martial race in the period of the British Raj. This was a designation created by administrators that classified each ethnic group as either martial or non-martial. A martial race was typically considered brave and well-built for fighting. Whilst the remainder were those whom the British believed to be unfit for battle because of their sedentary lifestyles. However, the martial races were also considered politically subservient, intellectually inferior, lacking the initiative or leadership qualities to command large military formations. The British had a policy of recruiting the martial Indians from those who had less access to education as they were easier to control. According to modern historian Geoffrey Greenhunt on military history, the martial race theory had an elegant symmetry. Indians who were intelligent and educated were defined as cowards, while those defined as brave were uneducated and backward. According to Amir Samanta, the marital race was chosen from people of mercenary spirit, a soldier who fights for any group or country that will pay him her, as these groups lacked nationalism as a trait. The Rajputs of Bihar were inventor of martial art form Parikanda, which includes heavy use of swords and shields. This exercise was later included in the folk dances of Bihar and Jharkhand like that of Chau dance. On special occasions, a primary chief would break up a meeting of his vassal chiefs with Kandanarial, the distribution of daggers and coconuts. Another affirmation of the Rajput's reverence for his sword was the Karga Shapna, adoration of the sword, ritual, performed during the annual Navratri festival, after which a Rajput is considered free to indulge his passion for rapine and revenge. The Rajput of Rajasthan also offer a sacrifice of water buffalo or goat to their family goddess Kuldevta during Navratri. The ritual requires slaying of the animal with a single stroke. In the past, this ritual was considered a rite of passage for young Rajput men. Rajputs generally have adopted the custom of permanent seclusion of women. Rajput women could be incorporated into Mughal harem, and this defined the Mughals as overlords over the Rajput clans. The Sisodia clan of Mewar was an exception as they refused to send their women to the Mughal harem, which resulted in siege and mass suicide at Chittor. Historically, members from the Rajput ruling clans of Rajasthan have also practiced polygamy and also took many women they enslaved as concubines from the battles which they won. During numerous armed conflicts in India, women were taken captives, enslaved and even sold, for example, the capture and selling of Marwaz women by Jaipur's forces in the battle between Jaipur state and Jodhpur state in 1807. The enslaved women were referred to by different terms according to the conditions imposed on them. For example, a domestic slave was called Davri. A dancer was called a patar. A senior female slave retainer in the women's quarters was called badaran or vadaran. A concubine was called khavasin, and a woman who was permitted to wear the veil, like Rajput queens, was called a pardite. The term chakar was used for a person serving their superior, and chakras contained complete families from specific occupational groups, like Brahmin women, cooks, nurses, tailors, washerwomen. For children born from the illegitimate union of Rajputs and their inferiors, the terms like Goliye, Derogi were used for females and Gola and Deroga were used for males. The courtly chronicles say that women who were perceived to be of higher social rank were assigned to the harems of their conquerors with or without marriage. The chronicles from the Rajput courts have recorded that women from Rajput community had also faced such treatment by the Rajputs from the winning side of a battle. There are also a number of records between the late 16th to mid-19th century of the Rajputs emulating the queens, servants, and slaves of a king upon his death. Ramya Srinivasan also gives an example of a Jain concubine who went from being a servant to a superior concubine called Paswan. According to Priyanka Khanna, with Marwaz's royal Rajput households, the women who underwent concubinage also included women from the Gujar, Ahi, Jat, Mali, Kayastha, and Darji communities of that region. These castes of Marwar claimed Rajput descent based on the census data of Marwar, 1861. However, the research by modern scholars on the forms of slavery and servitude imposed by ruling clans of Rajasthan's Rajputs between the 16th and early 19th centuries on the captured women faces hurdles because of the sparse information, uneven record keeping, and biased nature of historical records. Ravana Rajput community of today was one such slave community. The male children of such unions were identified by their fathers' names and in some cases as bhai, foster brothers, and incorporated into the household. Examples are given where they helped their step-brothers in war campaigns. The female children of concubines and slaves married Rajput men in exchange for money, or they ended up becoming dancing girls. The scarcity of available brides due to female infanticide led to the kidnapping of low-caste women who were sold for marriage to the higher clan Rajputs. Since these sales were genuinely for the purpose of marriage, they were considered legal. The lower clans also faced scarcity of brides, in which case they married women such as those from Gujar and Jat communities. Semi-nomadic communities also married their daughters to Rajput bridegrooms for money in some cases. Alan Fanger, an anthropologist from Kutztown University of Pennsylvania, conducted research on certain Rajput groups in a region in Uttar Pradesh, now in Uttarakhand, in the late 20th century. He studied the custom of selling their women for marriage among these Rajputs for a bridal price. Bridal price is the price paid for the purchase of a bride by the groom's family to the bride's family, not the bride herself. Joshi quotes in this context of bridal price, among these Rajputs, a woman is a chattel, who is purchased for one of the sons by the father of the family. The nature of the transaction is more the acquisition of a valuable article for the family than a contractual relationship between a man and a woman. Prior to the British rule in 1815, the husband had complete control over the wife, and he as well as his heirs could sell her or her children as slaves. Bride wealth is also discussed in North Indian Rajputs of 19th century India by the University of Toronto historian Malavika Kasturi. She states that Rajputs belonging to social groups where their women worked in the fields received bride wealth from the groom's family. She adds that evidence shows that the assumption made by officials of the time that female infanticide among clans was a result of poverty and inability to pay dower is incorrect. Between 1790 to 1815, the sale of wives and widows was taxed and a duty was applied to their export. Fanger writes, this right to sell a wife, a widow, or her children eventually ceased under the British, but the custom was not completely eliminated. Berriman has reported this kind of traffic in women in the nearby district of Garhwal, among the culturally similar Gawali Rajputs, 1963 ratio 74-75, and in the 1960 I found this practice still occurring in a village near Pakhura. The Tul Jat, Rajput males could also take Rajput women as concubines. What was marriage for a Rajput was simply getting a concubine for a Tul Jat. A Rajput woman sold for bridal price was allowed to marry another man as long as the original husband was reimbursed and could also run off with Anu Tahir man and legitimize the union with her lover by reimbursing the original husband. However, since the beginning of the 20th century, dowry trends had begun to replace bridimony. These Rajput groups of Uttarakhand today were formerly classified Shudra but had successfully converted to Rajputs. status during the rule of Chand Rajas that ended in 1790. Similarly, the Rajputs of Gharwal were originally of lower ritual status and did not wear the sacred thread until the 20th century. However, as they had already successfully achieved the Rajput identity earlier, Fanjr concludes that Sanskritization does not explain the change in trend from bride price to dowry. According to him, opportunities to observe orthodox customs brought about this change in custom. Secondly, the contribution of the Rajput woman in agricultural labor decreased due to more male employment, hence bride price was not necessary. Thus bride price marriages that were traditional and with little attention to any Brahmanical rituals slowly changed to dowry marriages in the 20th century, except for the poorer Rajputs. A Rajput man admitted to Fanjr that although he had bought all his 3 wives, he had given his daughter in marriage as Kanyadan, without accepting money, as it would mean he was selling her, and added, "We do not do this anymore." During the British rule, their love for pork, i.e. wild boar, was also well known, and the British identified them as a group based on this. The Indian Rajputs fought several times for the Mughals but needed drugs to enhance their spirit. They would take a double dose of opium before fighting. Muslim soldiers would also take opium. Mughals would give opium to their Rajput soldiers on a regular basis in the 17th century. During the British rule, opium addiction was considered a serious demoralizing vice of the Rajput community. Arabs brought opium to India in the 9th century. The Indian Council of Medical Research on Pattern and Process of Drug and Alcohol Use in India states that opium gives a person enhanced physical strength and capacity. Studies of K. Ganguly, K. Sharma, and Krishnamachari on opium usage also mention that the Rajputs would use opium for important ceremonies, relief from emotional distress, for increasing longevity, and for enhancing sexual pleasure. Alcoholism is considered a problem in the Rajput community of Rajasthan, and hence Rajput women do not like their men drinking alcohol. It was reported in a 1983 study of alcoholism in India that it was customary for Rajput men, not all, in northern India to drink in groups. The women would at times be subjected to domestic violence, such as beating, after these men returned home from drinking.